Today we're looking at something really interesting, how the actual language in ancient texts, specifically the preexilic books of the Bible, can give us clues about the
It's
past.
like linguistic archaeology in a way.
Yeah, I like that. So our mission is to check out 10 specific language features. We'll see how they're used, where they pop up, and if those patterns line up with what historians and archaeologists have found, it might even help date these texts.
And we're drawing heavily on some great scholarship here, mainly Yoel Elitzer's article, The Interface Between Language and Realia in the Preexilic Books of the Bible.
Right. So where do we start this linguistic dig?
Well, Elitzer's whole premise is pretty cool.
Yeah.
We generally know Preexilic Hebrew is different from Post-Exilic, but he goes deeper. He's looking within that earlier period.
Yeah.
His idea is, language changes constantly. So if we track specific words, specific phrases, how often they appear, which books they're in, we might spot connections to the real world back then. History, archaeology, it's where language meets realia, the stuff of daily life.
Makes sense. Language reflecting reality. Okay, so what's our first example?
Let's start with Deuteronomy 26.5. It has this phrase, often translated, "My father was a fugitive Aramean," in Hebrew, fugitive Aramean. What's the context there?
It's part of the first fruits declaration. Someone's bringing their harvest offering and recounting their people's history, starting with Jacob, essentially.
Right, and the key word is fugitive, applied to an Aramean. What's the historical angle on the Arameans?
Well, if you look back at the second millennium BCE, so I think Bronze Age mostly, the Arameans, sometimes called Alamu in other texts, they were largely nomadic groups. Sheep herders moving around Mesopotamia, the Syrian steppe. They weren't yet these big, organized kingdoms.
Okay, nomad. Yeah. But then, around the, let's say, 11th century BCE, maybe a bit earlier, things change. They start forming actual kingdoms, Aram, Damascus, Aram, Zobah, places like that, north and northeast of Israel.
And they become major players, right? We see that in the books of Kings.
Absolutely. They become a serious political and military force, often clashing with Israel, until the Assyrians eventually defeat them, particularly Damascus in 732 BCE.
So calling Jacob, or the ancestor figure, a fugitive Aramean, how does that fit the timeline?
That's the core point Elitzer makes. Fugitive, or wandering, fits that earlier nomadic picture much better than the later period when Arameans were either ruling powerful kingdoms or were a defeated people remembered for their past might.
So it suggests the phrase, and maybe the text around it, remembers that earlier period, before the 11th century.
That's the implication of taking the phrase at face value. It points towards a pre-monarchic setting, linguistically speaking. Now, scholars have other ideas, of course.
Right, you always have alternative interpretations.
Sure. Mazar thought maybe nomad just became a traditional title, even after they settled. Zakovich suggested tweaking the text. Levin saw it as maybe idol-worshipping Aramean. Lipashitsky suggested semi-nomadic.
But Elitzur argues the simplest reading points earlier.
Yes, he argues the plain meaning fits best with that pre-11th century reality. And importantly, this lines up with how the Pentateuch generally depicts Arameans associated with the patriarchs, like Laban or Balaam. They're portrayed in a nomadic or semi-nomadic context. No big Aramean cities or powerful kings mentioned there.
And archaeology backs up that early picture, too.
Broadly, yes. The archaeological evidence for early Aramean settlements fits that gradual emergence picture. So the language here seems to preserve a memory consistent with that earlier phase.
Okay, interesting first point. What's next? Water sources.
Yeah, let's talk water. Specifically the words bor for cistern and bor from royar for well. Essential stuff in that region.
Definitely. How did they get water, usually?
Archaeologically, there's a really noticeable shift between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in Israel. Bronze Age sites often relied on natural springs or wells dug down to the water table, maybe some larger reservoirs.
Makes sense. Stick close to the water.
Right. But in the Iron Age, particularly Iron Age II, we see a huge increase in the use of plastered cisterns. They figured out how to use lime plaster to make rock-cut pits watertight so they could collect rainwater.
Ah, a game changer.
Totally. It meant you could build settlements up in the hills, away from the springs and valleys. You could capture the rain where you lived.
So how do these words bor and beer show up in the Bible? Does the language track this tech shift?
It really seems to. Look, agree well. It appears 27 times. Almost all of those are in the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers.
The stories of the patriarchs finding wells, Isaac's wells.
Exactly, those narratives. It pops up a few times later in poetry, but often seems more like a literary image there. Now, contrast that with a bare cistern. It shows up about 60 times.
More frequent overall.
Yes, and its distribution is different. In the Pentateuch, wells are clearly the main thing. Cisterns are mentioned, sure, Joseph getting thrown into a bore, a rule about cisterns in Leviticus. Cisterns you didn't dig as a blessing in Deuteronomy, but they aren't the default water source in the narratives.
But later on.
Later on, especially in the prophets and writings, which reflect more of the Iron Age reality, cisterns become much more prominent in the language. Think of that famous line from the Rabshakeh in 2 Kings 18 and Isaiah 36, trying to tempt the people of Jerusalem. Everyone drink water from his own cistern.
Right, implying private cisterns were common.
Exactly. That reflects the Iron Age reality. So you have, well, dominating the Pentateuch narratives and cistern becoming much more common linguistically in texts reflecting the later period. The language pattern seems to mirror the archaeological timeline of water technology.
It's like a subtle linguistic fingerprint of the era. Okay, example 3, officials and scribes.
Right. We're looking at two terms, lister and asut. Both can get translated as officer or scribe or official.
So what's the difference?
Well, look at where Exodi Shoter appears. It's all over Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, really frequent in those books, describing the wilderness period and the conquest.
Okay.
It shows up once in Proverbs, meaning something like manager, maybe, and then it reappears in Chronicles, but Litzer thinks that might be Chronicles deliberately using an old word, kind of an archaism.
Okay, so shooter seems early. What about its meaning?
Interestingly, early translations like the Greek Septuagint often rendered it as scribe. And it's probably an old Semitic word, not just borrowed from Akkadian as some thought. It seems to denote some kind of official, maybe involved in record keeping or administration at a local or tribal level.
Got it. And the other term, sofer.
Kur appears 54 times. It really takes off from the time of King David onwards. It becomes the standard term for a high-ranking scribe or secretary in the royal court, a state functionary.
Ah, so a shift with monarchy.
Seems like it. And notice, the Urchukia Shodrim in the early books are often mentioned in the plural, the officers.
Oh.
But the Archer Shuver in the monarchy is often singular, the scribe, like Shaphan the scribe.
A more centralized role.
Possibly reflecting that. And then later, in the post-exilic period, you get the Kwev, Sophrim, like Ezra, who are more religious scholars and copyists, a different kind of professional scribe, distinct from the earlier royal officials.
So the terminology seems to track the political evolution, from tribal Shodarim to royal Sofer to post-exilic Sophrim.
That's the argument. The language reflects the shift from a tribal structure to a centralized monarchy with its royal administration. The rise of the Sofer coincides with David establishing the kingdom.
Fascinating how job titles can tell a story. Okay, number 4 is a place name. Sherohin.
Yes, Sherohin. It appears in Joshua 19 in the list of cities for the tribe of Simeon. What's immediately noticeable is that it doesn't sound like a typical Hebrew or Canaanite place name. And interestingly, in a parallel list for the tribe of Judah's territory in the Negev in Joshua 15, we find a place called Shehim in the Shimon, in roughly the same area.
Shilim, any connection?
The suggestion is they might be variants for the same place. And this gets really interesting when you bring in Egyptian records.
Egyptian records mention these places.
They mention a place called Sharon quite a few times in texts about kicking out the Hyksos in Thutmose III's lists, Amenhotep III, Ramses II, and importantly, Pharaoh Shishak's list mentions Ashurim.
Okay, Sharon and Sharon. How do they connect to the Hebrew?
Well, Shurdom looks a lot like Shalim, especially since we know Egyptian scribes often swapped art for Isle when writing Semitic names, particularly from the New Kingdom onwards. And Shurun is almost identical to Shurun, allowing for common slight variations in vowel sounds when transcribing.
Wow. So we have the Egyptian version matching Sharon and another Egyptian version matching Shurlim, and these appear in parallel biblical lists.
Exactly. You've got both the local Canaanite Hebrew name, Shilim, and the Egyptian name, Sharohen, reflecting Shurin, showing up side by side in related contexts.
What does that mean, though? Why use both?
It strongly suggests a period when both names were known and used, likely reflecting a time of significant Egyptian influence or presence in Canaan, a time when people might refer to the place by either its local name or the name used by the dominant regional power, Egypt.
So a time after the Israelites arrived, but before Egyptian power totally waned.
That seems to be the window. It would fit the late Bronze Early Iron Age transition. And it also supports arguments, like Yehezkel Kaufman made, that these city lists in Joshua might be quite early, possibly reflecting the situation before David conquered Jerusalem, since the lists still call it Jebus.
Okay, that's a complex but neat piece of evidence.
Yeah.
Number 5 takes us back to the land itself, Canaan.
Yes, the terms Eretz, Canaan, land of Canaan. Hakinani, the Canaanite? Or just Cana, Canaan and Canaan?
How often does that come up?
A lot in the early books, about 141 times from Genesis 10 through Judges 5, the Song of Deborah. It really peaks in Genesis, talking about the patriarchs living in Canaan, and then again in Joshua and early Judges, describing the conquest of Canaan.
Okay, makes sense for those periods. What happens after that?
It drops off dramatically. After Judges 4, which describes the big defeat of Jabin, king of Canaan, poof, the term becomes much rarer.
So when the Canaanites are no longer the main political entity on the scene, the term fades.
Seems like it. When it does appear later, it's often quoting an earlier text or referring to specific groups like the Phoenicians or Philistines on the coast, or sometimes it even takes on the meaning of merchant.
Interesting how the meaning shifts, too.
Yeah. But the main distribution pattern, heavy use, during the time the narratives depict Canaanites as the primary inhabitants and adversaries, then a sharp decline strongly suggests the term's prominence reflects that specific historical period.
The language reflects the contemporary political reality again. Okay, number 6, congregation.
Right, Ida. It appears 149 times. 16 of those are in poetry, but the prose usage is telling. It's very frequent in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the first part of Joshua. The stories of the desert wanderings, the organization at Sinai, the initial settlement. But then in Judges, it only shows up 4 times. And it's almost completely gone from Deuteronomy, Samuel, Kings, and the post-exilic books, maybe barring a couple places that seem to consciously echo the earlier texts.
That's a very distinct drop-off. What's the significance?
Well, some used to link Ida specifically to the post-exilic community of the Second Temple period. But scholars like Gordis, Hurwitz, and others have pushed back, saying the evidence points earlier.
Earlier how?
The distribution strongly suggests Ida was the term for the collective community, the assembly, during the tribal period before the monarchy. It seems to be the institution of the Confederacy. The people gathered together during the Exodus, wanderings, and early settlement.
So it faded as the tribes settled and then the monarchy rose.
That seems to be the case. It's distinct from another word, krioko, also assembly, which you find used throughout the Bible, including in later books. Ida seems particularly tied to that pre-monarchic tribal phase.
Any idea why?
Elitzur mentions a possible link to the root YCD, meaning to appoint or to summon. Maybe it relates to how the tribes were summoned, perhaps by trumpets, as you see described in Numbers and Judges. Its absence from Deuteronomy is also interesting given debates about when Deuteronomy was written or compiled.
Another linguistic marker potentially pointing to an earlier social structure. Okay, number 7 is an action. To strike with the edge of the sword.
Yes, the Hebrew phrase "seit oreb hekot." It occurs 33 times. If you set aside Job, where it might be intentionally archaic language.
Because Job is often seen as having later, perhaps, archaizing language.
Exactly. If you set that aside, the phrase clusters pretty strongly in Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, books dealing with the conquest and early conflicts.
Okay, edge of the sword. Does that tell us anything about the type of sword?
It likely does. Based on archaeology, the common sword in the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, the period of the conquest and Judges, was the sickle sword. You know, the curved one. In Egyptian, it's the pupesh.
Right, I've seen pictures of those.
That curved shape means it primarily cuts with its outer edge. So striking with the edge of the sword is a very apt description for combat using a sickle sword.
As opposed to a straight thrusting sword.
Right. And interestingly, the one time a double-edged dagger is explicitly described as a weapon being used, not just symbolically, is Ehud's dagger in Judges 3. The text makes a point of how he hit it and how he used it, suggesting it was perhaps somewhat unusual for the time or required a specific technique.
So the common phrase reflects the common weapon of the era described in those books.
That's the idea. Yigael Yadin, the famous archaeologist, argued exactly this, that the frequency of this phrase in the Joshua narratives points to the sickle sword being dominant during the conquest campaigns. The straight double-edged sword became more common later, maybe influenced by the sea peoples, including the Philistines.
The language of warfare reflecting the technology of warfare. Makes sense. Okay, number 8. Bala. Lords or masters of a city.
Yeah, Bale followed by a city name, like Bale HaShechem. The lords or leaders or aristocracy of Shechem. This term appears 21 times.
And where do we find it?
Almost exclusively between Joshua 24 and 20 Samuel 21. So basically, the period of the judges and the very beginning of David's reign. It's especially common in the story of Abimelech in Judges 9, dealing with the leaders of Shechem.
Why that specific time frame? What was going on politically?
Well, think about the period before David really consolidated the kingdom. The land was full of independent city-states, Canaanite holdouts, little kingdoms here and there. We see this in Egyptian texts like the Amarna letters from an earlier period too. Lots of local power centers.
Run by local leaders, local aristocracies.
Exactly, the Balai of the city. But once David and then Solomon established a strong central monarchy, the power of these local city elites was significantly reduced. They were absorbed into the larger kingdom.
So the term balai reflects that intermediate period, after the initial conquest, but before full monarchic centralization.
That's the argument. It flourishes linguistically during the time of the judges, when these local power structures were still very significant, and then it fades as the kingdom unifies.
Is it used at all later?
There's one interesting case in 2 Samuel 6, the Tor Balei Yehuda. It's usually translated the men of Judah, or citizens of Judah. Elitzer sees it as a slightly different, maybe more sophisticated usage, possibly playing on words related to where David was going, Belial of Judah, and who was with him, the leaders of Judah. But the core meaning of city aristocracy seems tied to that earlier period.
Okay, two more. Number 9, the arms barrel.
Ku'ul, literally carrier of equipment weapons.
Where does this role appear?
It's mentioned once for Abimelech back in Judges 9, but then it appears 18 more times. And all of those referred to the time of Saul and David. Saul's arms bearer, Jonathan's arms bearer, David's arms bearers when he's a warlord.
Only Saul and David's time. That's specific.
Very specific. The scholar Yossi Lashem studied this and argues the role this close personal warrior attendant to the king or commander really emerges with the formation of a more organized army under Saul, the first king.
What was the role exactly?
They carried spare weapons, maybe a shield, but they were also elite warriors themselves, fighting alongside their leader. The stories often emphasize their loyalty, like Saul's arms bearer refusing to kill him. It implies a really close bond.
So why does it seem confined to Saul and David's era? Why not later kings?
Lushem suggests it might be linked to the style of warfare then, which was more infantry-focused personal combat. As Israelite armies incorporated more chariots and cavalry, especially from Solomon onwards, maybe that kind of close personal arms bearer role became less central or changed, perhaps replaced by other roles like the shelish, the chariot warrior or officer.
So the term reflects a specific phase of early monarchic military organization.
That's the idea, tied to the very beginnings of the kingdom and that particular mode of fighting.
Okay, last one, number 10. Luka kingship.
Yes, Maluka. Not the kingdom itself, but the concept or institution of kingship.
How is it used?
It appears 24 times, mostly concentrated in the books of Samuel and Kings, the books dealing directly with the Israelite monarchy. There are a few later instances, too.
And you mentioned it's different from Samhalaga.
Right. Mamluka is generally the kingdom as a territory or political entity. Maluka is more the abstract idea, the status, the function of being king.
When does this specific term seem to emerge?
The argument is that it likely came into common usage with the establishment of the Israelite monarchy itself under Saul. Before that, the Israelites encountered foreign kings and kingdoms, and the texts mention them. But the need to talk about their own institution of kingship, the Maluka, seems to arise specifically when they get their own king.
It becomes a topic of discussion and definition for them?
Exactly. And it's interesting that a related phrase, O Zerahemluha, meaning seat of the kingship or royal descendants, only shows up quite late after the destruction of the temple in Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, talking about a lost royal line.
So the core term Maluka seems tied linguistically to the period when Israel had kingship, primarily reflected in Samuel and Kings.
That's the strong suggestion based on its distribution.
Wow. Okay, so that's 10 examples, from Arameans and water sources to officials, place names, swords, and the idea of kingship itself.
And in each case, the way the language is used, which words appear, where they don't appear, seems to potentially correlate with what we know from history and archaeology about those specific times.
It really paints a picture of language evolving alongside society and technology. These aren't just random word choices. They seem to carry echoes of their time.
Exactly. Elitzer's argument is that these linguistic patterns offer real clues, suggesting the text often reflect the periods they describe, aligning pretty well with the Bible's own internal timeline. It adds another layer to how we can understand the formation of these books.
It's a powerful reminder that language itself is an artifact, isn't it? Holding clues if you know how to look. And this was just a taste, 10 examples.
Just a sample. There's much more work being done in this area looking at syntax, other vocabulary. It's a fascinating field.
So a final thought then for our listeners to maybe chew on. How else could language, the words we pick, how we string sentences together, even our slang today, be leaving clues about our society, our time?
Yeah, what subtle messages are embedded in how we talk right now? What might future historians or linguists deduce about us just from the way we communicate? Something to think
If
about.
you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.